right, we are live.
Howdy, folks.
Hey, hey.
This is that wonderful, awkward moment at the beginning of a live stream call where we're waiting for the room to fill up. It's good to be here with everyone. Looking forward to getting into the discussion topic for the day today. We will ask if you're not automatically muted that you go on mute. The default should be that you come in muted, though. Good to see some familiar faces on the call, as well as some new folks. I'm going to give just one more minute, and then we're going to get started pretty much right at the 6:01 minute. In the meantime, feel free to use the chat button to drop in just a hello and maybe where you're calling from. Perfect. Room's filling up. Great. Well, folks, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I'm Rob Booth. I'm the head of field and mobilization at goodparty.org. And I'm excited for us to get into today's training, which is Strategic Advantage, all about how to navigate oppo research or opponent research, contrast messaging, and rapid response work. Really important stuff, especially as we get into sort of the final stages of a campaign. A lot of folks who are looking at the November election dates know that September to October is really sort of the heat of November campaign. And there's an old phrase about, an October surprise, that late breaking piece that can leave a lasting impression as people head into the polls. And a lot of opponent research and contrast messaging is really preparing for those things, trying to anticipate those things. So I'm excited to dive into that. Today, we're going to cover kind of the basic opponent research fundamentals. We're going to cover developing effective contrast messaging, so how you can compare yourself with your opponent without necessarily sliding into the mudslinging area. How to implement a rapid response strategy for if something does come up where you're being attacked by an opponent and you have to set the record straight. And we're also going to talk about tools and resources for both the research component of this work and also the messaging. The goal here is really to equip especially first-time candidates with the knowledge and the tools that you need to effectively research, craft that contrast message, and then swiftly respond to breaking campaign developments. Our expert today is my colleague, Alex Gibson, who serves as a part of GoodParty.org's Politico team. Alex, why don't you go ahead and start and give a little bit about yourself and why you're the perfect person to be talking about this particular issue. This is one that Alex signed up and I think maybe even pitched in his job interview as one that topic that he would want to give a little bit of focus to. So, Alex, take 2 minutes, give us your intro, and then we'll get started with the questions.
Sure. Yeah, my name's Alex Gibson. I'm a political analyst over here at goodparty.org. A little bit about my professional background. My career has been in electoral politics and the issue areas, as well as some candidate work as well. And a bit in the policy space in the state of Florida, working on some fiscal reform, trying to get fee elimination passed for juveniles who incur fees and some fines in the criminal legal system with an organization called the Fines and Fees Justice Center. My passion is politics and people, and I really love to see those systems and the people that operate in those systems flourish. So It's interesting to see you all's faces, or the lack of you all's faces. And I really hope that I can take my experience and what I've learned about comms and political comms and my years of experience and help you all today with your races.
Awesome. Well, we're going to get into the training topics here. As always, for folks who have been on these calls before, I love to see questions pop into the chat box throughout. If you have a question, ask it as it comes to you. And if I can, I'll weave it into the questions that I've already planned to ask Alex and to make a good bit of kind of ongoing discussion. If we miss anything that's in the chat, there is about 10 to 15 minutes that we're going to hold for open questions at the end. But I feel like these typically go the best when they're conversational and when I'm able to pull in your questions as they come up in real time. So don't be shy about using that chat box. I'm going to keep my eye on it throughout the call. But why don't we start right from the top? And Alex, I want to give you a chance to explain the importance of oppo research or opponent research in a political campaign.
Sure. So, Oppo research, let's roll with Oppo research just to not confuse opposition and opponent for the sake of the call. So, Oppo research is important in a political campaign because you want to know who you're running against. And a lot of you already know who you're running against, and there might even be the reason why you want to unseat them. You know how they run the position versus how you would run the position, and the aspirations you have versus what they said they would do, and maybe the broken promises that they've left. So I think Oppo research is important because it helps you understand your opponent, all of them that you may be going against. It's going to help you with message framing when you do have to come up with messaging. Let's say you are attacked, it's going to help you if you have the research done already. It's going to help you frame messages and respond back really quick. It's going to help you with your contrast messaging, or you're like juxtaposing yourself as a good candidate as opposed to the person who's running or the person who's already in that seat, who's running for their to get reelected again. And then it's also always going to be about informing the voters and those in your electorate, right? I think that's the main push for all of the anyone with political aspirations, informing voters and also kind of leading those voters.
Perfect. And I know in the prep for this conversation, you showed that you think that there's really four key components to doing oppo research well. Can you share what those four components are?
Sure. So I think it's going to start with data collection for sure. Like collecting all the articles, anything in print you can find on your opponents. It can be really cumbersome sometimes. You may have to practice some due diligence. You may have to comb through meeting minutes. You may have to go through agenda items. You may have to really like find their name, especially for the hyperlocal offices for the folks on this call. For those pursuing the hyperlocal offices, I think another really important one is finding out what that person is like when they're not in the limelight, right? What's their Facebook account look like? What's their Instagram account look like? What are they interested in? Where do they fish on the weekends? That kind of stuff is going to be really important because it's all going to bleed into them as a political candidate. And then choosing your medium for messaging is going to be really important also. So once you develop your messaging, you've collected your data, you've looked into your opponent's personal life, without violating any personal boundaries or whatever, choosing the medium for where you're going to actually use that messaging, or actually where you're going to like have that messaging present itself, is going to be really important. And then I think there should be an emphasis on research for the incumbents. And I say that because there's a lot more information for folks who are already in the office, right? You can look at an analysis of their policy. How did they use tax dollars? What did they say they were going to do versus what they actually did when they were in office? That kind of thing is really going to be important. And then yeah, I think it's really important to see the impact of their policy and what it's had on their constituents versus what you want to do and the potential impact of that on the voters in that area. Again, this is a position where you want to lead, so that's going to be really important.
Yeah, and I think with incumbents too, oftentimes it's good to look into who they accepted donations from along the way of their path to getting elected in the first place, and also how those donations maybe have affected some quid pro quo with the type of policies that they decided to pursue.
No, that's exactly right, Rob. I'm not going to say a name, but there's a there's candidates in Florida, and this is why it's really important to look into folks' personal life. You'll notice that some may work in construction, right? But they're also pursuing a public office. If you really break down their campaign finance and see where they're getting donations from, the PACs, who runs those PACs, if it's something like car dealerships, if it's something like construction organizations and agencies, if it's auto insurance agencies and homeowners insurance agencies, you can kind of get a feel for how that candidate how that candidate is going to act when they're in office. So this is really important stuff. You really want to practice due diligence and really hone in on the research part of this phrase, oppo research. It's going to be really important.
Mhm. I see that Quinn has shared a question that came in from one of the folks who is watching through the Instagram live feed. They asked, can you run locally without a distinguished educational background? And I think the obvious answer is yes. And I think what I'd like to maybe pose to Alex Gibson, who's talking about contrast messaging, if you were running and you didn't have necessarily a distinguished educational background, how might you play that to your advantage or use that to draw contrast against someone who went to Harvard?
I think people like to see themselves in their politicians. I think that's really important. You don't want to vote for someone you don't think has anything in common with you. And if your electorate or your voter base is also not folks who went to Ivy League, the fact that you went to Ivy League would kind of be irrelevant. I think that's really important to note. So really play to, if you don't have a formal education and you feel like that makes you weak, think about the strengths and what it does give you and the advantages you can assume because of that. It's not really about the biggest education or whatever. You will see a lot of representatives, a lot of senators, and a lot of folks in city council seats. Or actually, I'd stick with representatives and senators actually, because this is more common for them. They may be lawyers. If you break down their education, they didn't go to the best law schools. And the education is kind of irrelevant. They're still going to ask questions. They still don't. You can't assume their knowledge base just on the degree that they got 20 years ago. So it's important to really think about your strengths and not really their strengths. It's really going to be important to for the contrast messaging piece we're going to talk about in the future.
Yeah, Joe makes a great point. Tim Walz is doing this really well right now in terms of creating contrast between he and the vice presidential candidate, JD Vance, by saying, like all regular people, he grew up in the heartland. He didn't go to Yale.
Right.
He is creating that sense of contrast. Well, let's get back to the outline a little bit here. You talked about data collection. You talked about the type of things to look for kind of generally as you begin to get into some of this research. What are some of the ways that campaigns organize this research and analyze that information as they gather it? What are some of the tools that are of help for that? And how can you keep all of this information kind of built out?
Right. Well, I'll tell you this. If you have a Gmail account, you're like 80% of the way there already, because with Gmail comes Sheets, which is the spreadsheet software, and also Google Docs. I think that's, hey there, brother. And I think those are really going to help you with most of what you need for this for collecting data. I mean, for a spreadsheet, you can have a row number with just the number of articles, and you can house all of the articles there. So you can really, when you do your research on Google, you can link the articles right to your spreadsheet. You don't really have to worry about where they are. Using Google Docs, you can kind of break down or type your own feelings about the articles. I don't want this to get too complicated because everything you need can be done on Microsoft Word if you have it, or Google Docs if you don't have that, and then also Excel if you have it, or Google Sheets. It all could be free. And then the way that you analyze that information is going to be up to you. I'd say we all were born with like the best computers known to man, which is brains. And you can look at the information. You can look at the information and come to your own conclusions. I think the biggest part of Oppo research is going to be making your conclusions known to the voter base. So think about that when you look at an article about why an incumbent or why your opponent is running for office versus what they actually have done. And really think about how you want to frame that messaging, how you want to flip it on its head or take an offensive approach or a defensive approach, depending on the article at hand.
Yeah. And for anyone who's looking for templates for what a spreadsheet like this might look like, this is a good opportunity for me to plug the candidate channel in our Discord. And Quinn, if you can drop a link for folks to join the Discord in the chat, we'd be happy to share templates that our PAs and other members of the Good Party team have used. We'll post those in the candidate channel as a follow-up to this. But to sort of round out this question on research and doing these deep diggings, what are some of the ethical considerations? You've kind of talked about the limits and things to avoid throughout this, but what are some of the ethical considerations that you think people should keep in mind when doing Oppo research?
Yeah, I mean, I live by the golden rule. I can't really tell any, all of y'all how to live your life, but I'd say for sure don't do anything to others that you wouldn't want done to yourself. With that being said, you want to make sure that if you do concoct any kind of contrast messaging or rapid response, that it's accurate information. You're not just pulling something out of thin air to make yourself appear like from a higher moral posture. You want to respect personal boundaries, right? I mean, I can think of it during COVID when I worked in the policy space. I can think of a case where someone outed a cancer diagnosis from one of the representatives, and that just wasn't the prettiest thing. You want to avoid doing things like that because also things like that have legal repercussions, right? Or can have the depending on the situation at hand. Which is the last point. I think you want to do anything that'll avoid lawsuits. I don't know who on this call has ever went through a lawsuit, but they're not the funnest thing. So try to avoid those as much as you can. I would really hone in on those three things. So make sure you're putting out accurate information, respect personal boundaries, and really do everything you can to avoid having to stand in front of the court of law. So
There's also the risk that it has a negative blowback on the
right,
candidate themselves. Like if you put information out that is proven to be untrue or that crosses some of these lines, beyond the purely ethical pieces, it can have the reverse impact in terms of trying to get you more votes. It can cost you votes. So that's definitely something to keep in mind.
for
Uh,
sure. I think if you're lying during your candidate race, what you'll do in the office is going to be really alarming to the folks who have to vote for you. So keep that in mind.
So Paul asks a smart question here, and a good question related to doing this Oppo research. What is the best way to get voting records of an incumbent, whether that's at the city level or county level position?
This is a great question. If it's at the city or county level, depending on how they store it, you can go online. Again, it's going to take some due diligence. You can look through meeting minutes of when these resolutions or when these policies are voted on, and you can see it should be a voting count of who voted and how they voted. For a lot of smaller jurisdictions, I know that it's not going to be like a, a governing body of record. So you may have to go down and go to your recorder or your clerk's office, and you may have to ask for that directly. And I really doubt that there'd be a fee attached to that. I think it's all public information. I would double check that with them though. But all of this information is public. How they vote on things is public, and you should be able to access it directly on your city site or on your county site. And again, these things are not pretty documents, right? Going through meeting minutes, it may be a 50-page document. You may be looking for half of one of the pages, but it's going to be well worth it when you get to the messaging or the strategy of the messaging overview that you want to get to.
Great. So I want to move on from research to actually crafting some of the effective contrast messaging. But first, what is contrast messaging and why is it so important?
Yeah, I think contrast messaging is it's running yourself, it's running your strengths by your opponent's weaknesses. I think it's the best way to put it. So what are their weaknesses? What are my strengths? And then you're coming up with messages to say, I believe in this, whereas they don't take a stronger stance on this, or they actually don't believe in this. So you're contrasting yourself against the other opponent to make sure that you talk to a voter base that you want to talk to, and that you're securing those votes with that voter base. I think this is really a time to hone in on your strength. It can be difficult for first-time candidates to really think of what their strengths is because a lot of people may not feel that confident because they haven't assumed office yet. I wouldn't think about that. Just think about the strength that you possess, transferable skills from professional careers, from your personal life. How are you a leader? How are you a leader in your own household? I think about those kind of things and how those can transfer to what you want to do for the community at large. A really important point is you really want to be unique here. You don't want to be a cookie cutter candidate, meaning that if you all were the same, there would be no point of an election. If all the candidates on the ballot were the same, why are we voting? Like we can just stay at home. So focus on your strengths, your individuality, and your your unique attributes, and I just play to those strengths while also pointing out the opponent's weaknesses. And that's what contrast messaging is.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, elections are about a choice, and they usually get boiled down to, you're choosing this vision for this office, or you're choosing this vision, right? And if you aren't able to offer up a clear enough and concise enough articulation of what your vision is, in contrast to the opponent, then you're probably not going to be able to win the election. For those playing along at home, I'd be interested in the context of this big presidential election that's happening. Feel free to drop what you think the contrasts is from either candidate's perspective. What is Donald Trump saying the contrast is between him and Kamala, and what is Kamala saying the contrast is between her and Donald Trump? But while you all are doing that, Alex, what are some strategies for crafting compelling contrast messaging? What goes into doing this well?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Rob. And I think the first and foremost thing that's going to be most important is knowing your constituency, knowing the voter base, because then you can kind of craft and cater the messages directly, or knowing what they digest and how they digest it, or where they even consume news. I think that's why national campaigns get kind of looked at weirdly, because you cannot possibly create one messaging strategy or copy that speaks to every community. But you guys can. For hyperlocal elections, you know the language of your community, you know how people talk, you know what resonates with folks. So I think the first and most important part of contrast messaging is knowing your constituency. From there, after that, I'd say really nailing down the medium. And when I say medium, I mean where is this messaging going to where is this messaging going to like where is it going to be released? Are you using Facebook? Are you posting somewhere else? That's going to be a really important part of the strategy for all of this. Are you doing direct mailers? Are you doing text banking, which goodparty.org can help you with, by the way, for our pro candidates here. And then you also want to create some really catchy and grabby visuals if you can. I think graphic design is really important in the copy space. And then if you're just coming up with contrast messaging that's going to be used in a medium that doesn't use for graphic design, you can kind of table that one. And then what's important also about contrast messaging, or having it be the most compelling, I think, is building a sense of urgency around why you should be the candidate and why the other person shouldn't be. This is really important. Elections are like the time from when you file for office to when you actually assume office. It's a finite time. So you want to build some urgency for the voters. You want to tell them, like, in this contrast messaging that I'm developing, it's important or imperative that you vote for me for this reason and don't vote for the other person for this reason. It's not something that they can think about and take a year or two to ponder on. You want to build some urgency around this issue. So yeah, I think I'd focus on those the most.
Awesome. And Alex, do you have any examples that you think of are really strong cases where contrast messaging helped a candidate, whether that's from campaigns that you've worked on or just campaigns that you can think of out in the wild?
You know what's a really good example, actually? I think to keep it independent, I think the Ross Perot's contrast messaging was really good. For those who remember Ross Perot, he ran, I think, in '92 against the first Bush, and he also ran against Bill Clinton, I believe. The good thing about Ross Perot is he was a wealthy guy, relatively himself. And he was really able to hone in on the need for America's economy to get better. And the contrast messaging that he did do was, because he was so rich, he was able to have it syndicated on TV during commercials and stuff. And he had these charts. So his contrast messaging was basically saying, like, this is what the opponents have done, or this is what young Bill Clinton in 1992 wanted to do. Oh, there goes someone holding up a Ross Perot book right there. Hey, Joseph. Yeah, and then he's talking about what he wants to do. And he also uses personal and professional leverage that he did have, his own competency skills that he had to create these graphs, and that weren't easy graphs to understand, but he made them easy to understand by communicating what was on the graphs using a pointer. I was not born during that time, which is hilarious, but he's a huge part of my political education. I think that candidacy and that campaign was pretty brilliant.
Yeah. I can think of so many examples of this that folks might be familiar with too. Like Obama obviously did a really good job of characterizing him as the candidate of hope and of change, and by proxy made John McCain feel like the candidate of the status quo. Right. That was sort of the way that those campaigns were positioned. Trump in his first election was really successful with the Make America Great Again messaging. And there was something kind of hollow about the Stronger Together branding that was put together by the Hillary campaign. I can go further back to, Lyndon B. Johnson running his famous Daisy ad against Goldwater and, painting this picture of a reckless candidate versus a candidate who would bring peace and stability. So many examples of being able to draw contrast. When you think of just like practical advice for candidates who want to draw contrast, are there any like rules of thumb or hints or tips of the trade that you would offer folks?
That I would offer, I'd say in terms of messaging, you always want to be concise. You always want to keep it as short as possible. You want it to be as catchy as possible. Like you said, Rob, I think there really was something to just change as a campaign slogan for Obama, or Make America Great Again, which is, I don't know, maybe 10 syllables, if that. Keeping it short is going to be really important. I think it's all going to come back to knowing your base. There are some tricks of the trade, but knowing your base is going to tell you how exactly to cater your messaging. Um, there are some things I would avoid, though, for sure. I think I would avoid things like alliteration. I think we all know the famous tongue twister ones like "she sells seashells by the seashore." You want to make sure your messaging is not sounding like that. You want it to be something that's replicable and that people can say oftentimes. So avoid things like that. I'd avoid wordiness. I'd avoid, again, anything that's not accurate information. Um, Anything directly ad hominem about your opponent, I think I would also advise you all to avoid. And that means like, if I'm running against Rob, for example, and Rob's policy has caused more waste in public waters, I think that's not ad hominem. But if I said Rob has bad breath and he is not a good person, I think we should avoid messaging like that. Stay away from ad
Yeah,
hominem.
please.
Yeah. And avoid sounding too professional. You're again back to the education piece. Most Americans are not the most professional people. In fact, to the contrary, we all want to just, hang around, have a drink, have some fun. We don't really want to sound too professional or have conversations or talk about things that sound too wordy and too academic in its jargon. And then again, don't be too repetitious. You don't want to use words. You don't want to do things that sound too much alike. So yeah, those are some things I would avoid.
So some questions from the chat. Brittany asks, she has an opponent who's an incumbent who isn't really addressing the election at all. Do you need your opponent to play along to be able to use contrast messaging?
Not at all, especially if they're an incumbent. Again, I think there's so much research that can be done once you're running against someone who's incumbent because they're on the record for doing things or saying things that you can leverage against them. You don't need them to play ball. You can take the offensive. You don't have to be on the defensive all the time. On defense all the time. Being on the offense is just as good as being on the defense, Brittany. I don't know where you are, but
yeah, I see.
oh, hey, Brittany, sorry. There you go.
I see Catherine responded to that. Maybe use that as he or she doesn't think that they have to fight for your vote. And like immediately in my political hack head, I'm thinking, voters deserve a politician who's going to show up and listen to them and campaign for their vote. So I think there's definitely some ways that you can use that as contrast messaging.
Yeah, Catherine, that's a great point. Yeah, you think I'm just gonna go to the polls and vote for you. Yeah, I think that's also something you should leverage.
Stacy asks the question, what is your suggestion when someone asks you something that you don't know or possibly haven't heard of? Mentions that she plans on saying, I'm not sure, but I'd love to hear what you think about that topic as a response. Yeah, Alex, and any advice for Stacy on when you get asked, maybe particularly like a policy question that you're not aware of the answer
Right.
to?
Yeah, I think it's okay to not know. I think that's one of the most important pieces of advice I can give. It's okay to not know. Even if you look at our top politicians, I won't get into a contentious topic, but if you look at how the State Department advisors, for example, or how the head of urban planning and transportation answers a question when asked by reporters, if they don't know, they always say, "We're not exactly like we can get back to you." It's not a given that you know. And it doesn't necessarily always reflect bad on you. And to your point, uh, Stacy, sorry, to your point, Stacy, I think it's always good to ask how the person feels about it, especially if it's a voter. It's really important to know how your voter base is feeling about something. And also, I'm blanking, what was I going to say? Oh, it depends on where exactly you're being asked this question. If it's in a candidate forum, for example, candidate forums are like where people have to talk about their platform points themselves versus the opponent. It's almost debate-like, but not necessarily like a debate. Um, then again, it's good to kind of pivot the conversation. This is where you can show your leadership and communication skills and pivot the conversation a bit. But if it's in a medium where it's not the most serious and it wouldn't really hurt or cause you political points, I think it's always okay to say I don't know. I'm always open to education, but at the moment, I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. I think maybe it's something not that formal, but it's okay to say that.
So another question here. Catherine shares, some specifics around an opponent, and they're pretty damning,
Oh
right? It's
gosh.
a opponent who's been found guilty of having intercourse with a minor, having ammunitions and explosives in a bunker in their basement, and having a restraining order against their ex-wife, and asks, how do you know, use that without being ad hominem in the attack? And I have some advice for this one. That's a doozy, right? But I would focus first on public safety and trust in terms of your messaging on this. So, I would say something along the lines of, our community deserves leaders who uphold the highest standards of integrity and can be trusted to prioritize public safety. My opponent has been found guilty on crimes that compromise the safety and well-being of our community, and we need a representative who will protect and not endanger. So that's a way to address that with the facts and not the person, and it also leaves the space for people to do their own research. Okay, he's been found guilty on crimes. You don't need to get into the specifics of those crimes, but you need to allow the breadcrumb trail based on facts that will allow people to get there. So I would focus without bragging in, you don't say this person is a terrible person. You say this person has been found guilty of committing crimes that endanger the safety of our community, and our community deserves better than that. That's how I would speak to something like that. And it's also a matter of making sure that your messaging allows people to only go as deep down that rabbit hole as they need to, right? Even when we talk about some of the more high profile instances of people who are running for office who've been convicted of crimes, of felonies, et cetera, that's usually all that you hear, right? That they have been convicted, that they have been found guilty. What specifically those crimes are, we let people go into looking into themselves. So let's pivot now out of the contrast messaging piece and talk about rapid response strategy. So again, let's start with the one-on-one. Alex, what is rapid response and why is it so crucial to campaigns?
That's a good question. I have a pretty complex answer. You ready? Rapid response is responding rapidly. I think it's when something has come out, how quickly can you get on top of that messaging and turn a defensive moment into an offensive one, or even maybe just get on the offense about something. So for example, if something comes out about a candidate, like for example, a charge, um, do you want to, I think the decision first is, do you want to respond to that rapidly? If a candidate gets arrested on a DUI tonight, in the morning, do you want to have a piece about it, ready to go? That's rapid response, right? Um, I think it's going to help you take action against attacks from opponents. That's going to be your defensive maneuvers. It can help you capitalize on recent news. This can help you turn a moment of maybe not the greatest political momentum into your favor. So if someone's did something in the news recently and it hasn't, it's something that can hurt their campaign and help yours, it's a good rule of thumb to kind of take advantage of that. And that's going to always be your comms, the comms and how you rapidly respond to messages. And then again, keeping a good pulse on keeping a finger on the pulse of the race and staying in control of your messaging and knowing what you want to say, what you're not going to respond to, what you should respond to is always going to be really important. Again, we are political strategists. We have information on the places that we've worked races, but you guys are going to be the experts in your area. You know the political landscape better than we ever will. So it's important to know what exactly you should respond to, how it's going to reflect in your community or the race that you're running in, and if you should respond to it. So that's going to be really key.
Great. And how can candidates prepare for and manage unexpected events or attacks?
Sure. I think if you have a team, this is where it's going to really shine. I think scenario planning, or if you're like me and you just like to envision situations in the shower or in front of a mirror, I think scenario planning is going to be really important. If you can think of possible situations and scenarios, think about how you respond to them. It'll give you a lot of time to prepare. Uh, and then also, I think another really important piece is doing opposition research on yourself. It's going the attack from your opponent can be coming from something that they're doing or something the research that they're doing on you, some kind of oppo research that they're doing against their opponent, which is you in this case. So do it on yourself and see what's out there. What would someone create a messaging strategy around, and how would you respond to that in advance? It's better to be proactive in these situations than reactionary. That's going to be a really important piece. Um, and then be open to criticism and communication from the team, from your constituents. If you have released a message, be open to hearing how people feel about it, how your neighbor, how your kid's teacher, how your husband, how your wife, how anyone feels about that messaging. It may not have transferred over the best, and it's always good to know that you can pull the plug on things. And then take everything as a learning opportunity. Rapid response is something that all of the topics that we're talking about today, actually, rapid response, oppo research, these are things that firms exist solely for. They make their living just on this. So there's a lot of research and there's a lot of moxie that goes into this. You're not going to get it right away as a first time or second timer. Some politicians never get it in their entire lifetime. So give yourself grace and take everything as a learning opportunity.
When you think of sort of the key elements to an effective rapid response plan, is there anything that stands out?
Yeah, I think making sure that the articles that you collected, going back to data collection, making sure that they're stored properly, making sure that you've prepped and planned, making sure that you've ran through your scenario planning, you've ran your own name through a Google search engine, and you know what'll come up against you, and you know how to respond to those messages. And then you also make sure that you account for risk assessment, just to see at what point how much risk your campaign can incur during this race. That's going to be really important. I think those three should be key. So prep, make sure you're planning. Make sure that you store your data in a system that's secure, and then also make sure that you're running risk assessment to ensure that your campaign is always safe and that you're always out of harm's way.
So another question from the chat here: after you've responded, when do you let it go and move on to different messaging, or kind of return to your campaign's core messaging? Or if it's a gold mine, do you just keep going?
This is going to all come up to messaging strategy. I will say that you can beat a dead horse, which is not good for political campaigns and candidates. It's not going to be the best thing. And I think a good example, I think I feel comfortable saying this. There's some messaging about some of the presidential candidates on both sides that some folks are just tired of hearing at this time. They're like, can you come up with a new message now? Can you come up with some other reason I should hate Kamala or hate Donald Trump? So you can beat a topic dead. And it's good. Again, this is where it's going to be important to keep a really solid finger on the pulse of the race and what's happening in your election that you're running in. And if it's a gold mine, I would say, again, rarely do you find a political gold mine. It really has to be a home run. It really, Rob, can you think of an example of where there's something that you can just keep messaging on?
In modern politics and with how fast the news cycles move, not really.
Yeah.
It's the attention span in our country is getting shorter and shorter. So typically things have, about a 2 or 3 week cycle at most. I kind of also want to ask, how do you know something actually warrants a rapid response? Because sometimes there's an attack that you almost risk elevating by responding to.
Yeah, that's true. I think this is where it's important to really take risk assessment into account and really know if you respond to this message, what's the risk that you personally assume, and then also what risk does your campaign assume? Does your candidacy assume? You want to really run an assessment on this to make sure that is it even a viable or is responding to this messaging even viable for my campaign or for my own personal safety? I think that's really important to think about. Rob, to your question.
Great. And then we have a question here. How would you spin an incumbent legislator who sponsors no bills and doesn't get anything passed? They focus on constituent services, which the voters see as a positive, but they're not actually getting any legislation through.
Yeah, I mean, they're on the Hill for that reason, Joseph. I think I'd really mark in on or lean in on that for the voter base. They're on the Hill not to focus on constituent services, but they're because they can do that in another capacity. They're there to change the political landscape and the living conditions of all of the people in the state or the jurisdiction that they're working in. And if they're not doing that, then it's kind of like, why are they getting elected? Um, I think I'd really hone in on that. What do you think about that, Rob?
Yeah, I might even try to think if there are any specific missed opportunities. Are there big issues that are important to your constituents base? Let's give an example of, we had an opportunity to pass a bill that would have allowed us to finally repave Main Street, right? And this lawmaker was nowhere to be seen on the Hill with helping to get that relief money sponsored. Whatever the issue is that you can kind of tie it specifically to, we didn't send this person, to the state legislature, to Congress, wherever it may be, to cater to one or two of their constituents. We sent them there to pass laws for the entire state, the entire city, whatever it may be. So I think there is a good attack line there. And you can use, again, their record to drive that. Ooh, love instant runoff voting.
Yeah.
So that's a good one to hold their feet to the fire on.
Again, Joseph, to that point, also another thing that I would note is that there's things that they have had. I assume they would have had to do, opposed from instead of sponsoring bills directly. Like, what's their voting record in history in the Senate, and how they voted on certain things, and how those pieces of legislation hurt or helped the community. I'd focus on that, and then also any comment that they've made in chamber and in committee would be pretty important. Also, could be leveraged against them possibly. Again, these things are going to take a lot of time, though. These meetings are, on average, they're supposed to be an hour. I don't know about you, but in Florida, they can get pretty extensive. So you may have a bit to comb through for that.
Alex, what practical advice do you have in terms of best practices for monitoring news and social media so a team is ready for rapid response opportunities?
Yeah, I think having your local newspaper subscription is going to be really important. Or whatever, any newspaper relevant to the race that you're running in is going to be really important. Another thing that I did when I ran in the policy space was that I had Google News Alert set up so that if this keyword was ran or in an article or something, it would immediately come to my email and I'd see it first thing, so that anything released recently, we'd know about as a team, and I can kind of report that out, and we can start strategizing about how we should respond to that. So Google News Alerts, there's probably a tutorial on YouTube that probably take like 2 minutes per news alert. One thing I will say about the news alerts, you may have to set up quite a bit of them. So, for example, I worked on a juvenile fee elimination campaign in the state of Florida. So for that, I'd set up one for juvenile fee elimination, juvenile fees in Florida, Florida juvenile fees. You kind of have to run them through that kind of filter, but it's really fruitful because you never know how people are going to really run their title or run anything in their article. You never know how they're going to structure it. So you want to make sure that you're able to cover all bases. And then also know who to reach out on social media for news in your area. For example, I'm in Tallahassee. There's a lot of local Instagram pages where you can hear about people who are running for office. They're not official pages like the Tallahassee Democrat or Florida Politics, but it's really useful information that everyday voters hone into to kind of get their news. And it's accurate information for the most part. So knowing who to follow, keeping your finger on the pulse of the official press, and then also what the word of the community is. That's going to help you keep a good finger on the pulse of the monitoring for what you want to do for your race.
Great. Well, I want to pivot into talking about tools and resources, both for research and messaging. We kind of began to get our toes under the tent with that by talking about Google Alerts. What tools and platforms are available for conducting opponent research?
Yeah, there's a really complex tool that all of the top researchers use that I'm gonna clue you guys in on right now. You ready? It's called Google. Like I've ran Oppo research with the best of them, and it's always Google. You start with a good Google search, you can get just about everything you need. And there's also another software that came out, I think about 2 years ago or so, called ChatGPT, which people are finding really interesting. It doesn't hallucinate. So I'm gonna show my techie nerd side of it. Hallucinating is when AI comes up with things that does not exist at all. ChatGPT tends to not do that, whereas some other ones can. So where a Google search may not yield some results for you, ChatGPT probably could. And then it's also probably good to educate yourself on some kind of pre-crafted guides for contrast messaging for opposition research. I'm pretty sure they exist and there are free resources out there that's available. So those are the resources that I'd hone in on first. So Google's going to be really important. ChatGPT has a free 3.5 version, unless you don't for the I don't know what's the term, non-AI fans. I think Google's going to help you out. For those who don't mind AI, ChatGPT is your best bud. And then I'd also lean in on the pre-crafted resources made from a bunch of experts in the field that's available on the internet. So
You also mentioned that there are, firms that do Oppo research and that sort of thing. This is typically something that we only recommend for candidates who are running in statewide elections, if at all. But in terms of those firms, can you talk a little bit more about what they do and when's the right time to pull in a firm like that or put someone on Oppo research as a full-time job?
yeah, I think those firms, they work for the candidates and they're pulled in when the candidate really has no expertise on the area and also when they think the juice is worth the squeeze or the money poured into those firms is going to be worth the or is going to be able to turn out the election seat for them. Um, they use more complex research tools sometimes. They may delve into a LexisNexis. They may run someone's criminal report, that kind of stuff. But for the most part, it's not going to be anything that's apart from random Google searches. They may use different search engines like Bing, nothing that you don't have access to. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to share my screen for a moment because there's an exercise that everyone on this call can do that I think is at the core of good sort of contrast messaging and also just preparing yourself, whether that is for a debate or for a campaign in general. And it's just a four-way message box. So I'll share my screen. And as you guys can see behind me on the posters on my wall, I'm a comic book nerd. So the example that I have here is between a fictional campaign where Charles Xavier is running against Magneto. So we got the X-Men's teacher versus the X-Men villain, to be as broad as possible with this example. And any candidate that I work with, I sit down and I do this exercise where essentially I say, what do you say about you? And in the case of Charles Xavier, this is someone who's a visionary leader who's committed to unity and equality for all. He's dedicated his life to peaceful coexistence and has a proven track record for advocacy of mutant rights. His leadership is marked by empathy, wisdom, and a strong belief in the power of collaboration, right? Now, we also ask, what do we want to say about our opponent? So Magneto's approach is divisive and dangerous, often violent and aggressive. His tactics risk alienating potential allies and provoking unnecessary conflict. After we ask that, we also ask, okay, what would our opponents say about themselves? So we put ourselves in the mindset of our opponent to say, okay, how would they spin why they're a better candidate than I am? So Magneto champions the rights of mutants with fierce determination to protect and empower them. He believes that they must assert their dominance to ensure the survival and success of the species. And then finally, what do they say about us? And the importance of this exercise is that it helps to surface what some likely lines of attack would be. Now, this idea that Charles is, his idealism makes him naive or ineffective in the face of real world threats. He's not a strong enough leader. And from this, after you do this four-way split, you can find those trends, right? So the strength of this message is that it emphasizes unity and peace and long-term solutions. The weaknesses are that it could be perceived as overly idealistic and impractical. So you need to either find a way to acknowledge that or insulate from that line of attack. And the opportunities are to share that he has a commitment to realistic, achievable policies that build towards peaceful coexistence. And from that, you can build, a real messaging strategy. Our tool, the free tool at goodparty.org also generates one of these message boxes and pre-populates it with some answers based on the information that it collects from you in the onboarding phase. For people who are not as nerdy as me, we do have a fake Taylor Swift campaign for the Swifties out there to share what her message box would be in a theoretical run for Senate against Marsha Blackburn, which we highlight here. But this is all a part that is built into the campaign plan that is put together as a part of the free goodparty.org tools. So if you're looking to run that exercise for yourself, it can get you started, and then you can actually write in, alongside those answers themselves. So pivoting out of that, it really, again, encourage all of you to do the four-way messaging square for yourselves if you haven't already. But pivoting out of that, Alex, can you share some case studies from campaigns that successfully used opponent research, contrast messaging, and rapid response?
Sure, yeah, I'll share one in my home state because I'm just so Florida focused on one that's in my Senate district that I'm keeping my eyes on right now. So we have the incumbent Corey Simon, who is running for a seat, and he's running some kind of, I wouldn't say slandering messages. He's running some messaging against his opponent, Daryl Parks, who's raised a bit of money in quite a little amount of time to oppose him. And a lot of the messaging that he's using is saying that things like Daryl Park wants to defund the police, Daryl Park wants to raise insurance rates for the Floridians, things like that. And what the Daryl Parks campaign has done is they've pulled up everything that they can in terms of research and opponent research on Corey Simon. So they've pulled up the fact that he's been funded by some of the hugest political action committees that focus on in the realm of insurance, even though he says that Daryl Parks is the one receiving or that wants to raise insurance rates. They've pulled up the fact that Daryl Parks is on print and on record saying that he does not want to defund the police and thinks that the police are necessary, especially in places with high violent crimes. So that's also really important. And they crafted a video. It couldn't have been more than 2 days after the fact. It was extremely quick in terms of rapid response. That's been polling pretty well. So that's something that I've been keeping my eyes on. That's one example of a race where I think all of it was kind of combined. He did the research on his campaign finance to see that he was also, or not also, he was receiving money from a lot of insurance agents and political action committees. He created the contrast messaging, and then they fired back very quickly. and they kind of went from a defensive position to the offensive position immediately. It's like I don't know the folks on this call who are into martial arts. I'm not even, but it's like if you're on your back and you immediately flip your opponent on their back. It was genius in the political space. I think it was really that's a great example of that.
Yeah, and what do you think are some lessons that first-time candidates can learn from that example? I think there's a lot of things that kind of match the through line of earlier things from the training, but what really stands out to you about what worked well there?
I think the defense to offense is going to be really important. As a first-time candidate, incumbents may be pretty cocky and arrogant. They may feel like, who the hell is this person running up against me? This person's not that great. They may fire something out at you that puts you in a defensive position. It's really important to have a strategy for messaging that takes you off of your back and puts your opponent on the defensive instead. So that defense to offense is something that I think a lot of first-time candidates can really strengthen their campaign using.
Great. Well, we're reaching the point where we usually break and just go into just pure Q&A to wrap up. So we've got about 15 minutes or so to answer any outstanding questions that you have for Alex or I. But thank you guys for being active in the chat throughout this. You guys have asked some great questions, and feel free to drop more questions in the chat.
We have a question from Michael Canty, I think.
Yeah, you want to drop that in the chat, Michael?
Oh, yeah, I
good.
did already. I'll go quiet
Oh,
again. You check it out.
Oh, sorry, I missed it. Alex, do you see it? I'm not seeing it.
I don't. Michael, go ahead and drop it again for us.
In the meantime, I see that Kelly says, I'm running for school board. There are 3 seats and 6 candidates running, 2 of which are incumbents. How do you combat the non-incumbents, knowing that there's no track record to go off of? So this is just a good general question, Alex. If you're running against someone who doesn't have a voting record, they're a non-incumbent, how does that change the research process?
Yeah, that's really important. I think the research should be focused more on their personal life instead of their voting history as someone who sat in the seat that they're running for already. Why are you running for this seat, and what's your strength? What personal moxie do you have that makes you a really strong candidate for that seat? And contrasting that against what they lack personally that doesn't help them run for that seat. Yeah, so I think that's going to be really important. Putting the emphasis instead of like how they've stood politically in print on and putting it on how they live personally and why you'd be a better suit for this position. I think that's going to be really important for you in that race.
Yeah, I think with those non-incumbents, it's important to examine why did they decide to run for office. I think looking at what experience they bring to office and how does that compare with your own experience can be a way to provide some contrast. Opposition research isn't necessarily just looking for dirt. It can be, okay, this person is applying for a position that is on a school board that is responsible for managing a lot of money, right? And I'm a CPA, right? You would probably have a background that is better fit for the task at hand than someone who doesn't have a history with business, someone who has not managed large amounts of money. And there's a way to draw contrast between your level of experience as well, without ever going into disrespectful or, waiting for that magical moment where, it turns out that your opponent is a monster, right? Most of the time, that's not going to be the case. A lot of people who want to get into civil service are good people, and you need to be able to draw contrast respectfully. Ryan says, I can't find much on my opponent. He was just endorsed by the incumbent who is stepping down. Should I delve into the incumbent as a way to relate to the other candidate?
That's a great question. I think when incumbents are endorsing people, or even someone who is currently sitting in office, and when they endorse a candidate who's running, you have to think about what that means. What does an endorsement mean? It usually means that the same vision that the incumbent had when they were in the seat or still have for the future of that position. And then also the future that the candidate who's running that they recently endorsed has, they kind of run concurrent. So in that case, you can pull up information on the incumbent and almost kind of, you can't make a direct causal connection, but you can say that it's correlation between how this incumbent ran when they were in this position, or not ran, sorry, how they performed when they were in this position versus how the person that they just endorsed is going to perform in the position. And are you satisfied with that performance as a voter? And if they're not, I think I'd really play to that. What do you think, Rob?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to how well liked the incumbent is. You know, if there's an incredibly well liked incumbent who's deciding to step down or retire, I probably would leave that alone. But if it's a unpopular incumbent or an incumbent who maybe was phoning it in the last few years of holding office, I might say we can't afford, another 2 years, another 4 years of someone who's going to be, asleep at the job. So I'm excited to take this. I like, you can paint that endorsement as almost a negative thing if the person doing the endorsement isn't popular. So Jeremiah asks, I'm helping my friend run for governor. How do we go about releasing info that was given to us regarding the incumbent candidate? So that's a great question for Alex. And I would start by offering the hint that you got to make sure that you confirm that information is accurate before you release it. And that's a key part of the research piece. But Alex, yeah, how do you go about releasing information about an incumbent candidate?
Yeah, I think you read my mind exactly, Rob. I was going to say make sure the information is accurate first, and then you can get into your strategy, your messaging strategy for how you want to release this. Certain messages are going to carry better over certain mediums, so think about the medium pretty carefully. And then also, I would get in contact with this is where building relationships with the local press is going to be really important, because if I'm reading this question as how do we go about releasing info that was given to us, as how do we go about getting this on print or printing this, running this by an editor is usually like a columnist is usually something that they would also want to do. They also, just like you, want to print the juiciest information on anyone in the political sphere. They print it on you, honestly, if the information presented itself. So I'd say relationships with the local press would be pretty important, and also thinking of any virtual medium you want to use, while also using all of the tools and the tips that I've given during this training, making sure that the messaging is concise. If it's in a shorter format, making sure that it's not the longest thing. It doesn't have academic jargon. It doesn't repeat itself. That's going to be really important to making sure that it's actually palatable and digestible to the voter base. So yeah, make sure you cross your T's and dot your I's, Jeremiah.
Yeah, I would also say that there are some things that it makes sense for the campaign to release, or that for the campaign to reach out to the press about. There are some things that you're better positioned if that happens across an editor's desk anonymously, or from a constituent, concerned constituent. So consider what the best delivery vehicle or delivery message would be for this. Okay, another question I see here from Ryan. The other candidate has spent enough that they are required to file the financials in an open committee. They have not, so I have no visibility on where his money is coming from or going. How should I address this? This depends on what the elections and ethics bodies available to you are, but oftentimes you can report this as a campaign spending violation. Alex, any other thoughts on the best way to pursue that?
No, I mean, I was going to say exactly that. That seems to go against, in the state of Florida, what's called the Division of Elections rule, which is that you have to have you have to file a committee if you spend over a certain amount, and then you also have to have your campaign reports in for contribution and expenditures, and by that report due date that they set at the state level. I think friend is running for a governor's seat. Oh no, that's Jeremiah. I would still check in on that. It's all going to fall under the Division of Election or your state's tantamount office. I'm not sure if it's called Division of Elections where you are, but yeah, it's going to be really it's going to be really that's extremely strange. I'd say that. I've seen candidates punished for that.
I would not address it publicly in your messaging, Ryan, but I would make the inquiry officially with the election body. That is like you can initiate them looking into the fact that he's raised that money, and that like you can kick off the investigation. News is going to cover that kind of no matter what, and I wouldn't message around it, especially because until the findings come out, it's not really useful. You might message around it after the findings, but you can initiate them investigating first, and that's totally normal. Any other questions from the group?
I think Michael is struggling to access the chat.
Quinn, are you able to take Michael off of mute? We usually do these by text, but his isn't showing up. So
You hear me?
yeah.
All right, so this is my question, man. You know how TikTok and social medias, right? Even on Instagram, they all have like algorithms that they follow. Like, you know, if you, like I'm pro-Pally, so they're gonna send Palestinian feed to me because I'm gonna accept it, I'm gonna follow it. They're not gonna send Zio feed to me, or if they do, I'm gonna reject it, right? I'm gonna block it if I can. Well, my thing is like it locks me into an algorithm. There's like potential voters who are Zions and might, you know, eventually wake up. But how do I connect with, how do I identify is the question, the algorithm that's actually going to, or how do I identify the crowds, you know what I mean, that's in the social media that's not my typical crowds? Because I get a lot of people that's out of state.
Sorry, go ahead, Rob.
I think this underscores in part a importance in getting your message out as many different ways as you can. You can't just rely on one form of social media because there are algorithms that are changing on a day-to-day basis. There are certain posts that are being showed to like audiences. There are posts that get suppressed. There are all sorts of things that happen. I would say, again, like diversify how you're getting your message out there. I always encourage people, just like in marketing, there's a rule of 7 with connecting with voters. You typically have to communicate with them across 5 to 7 different ways to earn their vote. So that means like talking to a voter in person at an event. That means texting that voter. That means making a phone call, means knocking on their door. And eventually, you know, you hit them with the mailer. After 5 to 7 times of seeing your name and seeing what you stand for, it begins to sink in. So just in general, diversify how you get that message out there. If I knew how to hack every single algorithm, I'd be a much richer man than I am.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say, Rob,
I wouldn't be splitting my own wood.
That's the that's the $64,000 question. How do you break the algorithm? I think even tech companies are trying to figure that out. So I wish we can help there, but I'd definitely say exhaust as many avenues of communication as you can with your voter base.
Right. Well, thank you all for your thoughtful questions.
There's one more question from a Stephanie in the chat, which is about our text feature. So Stephanie, if you Stephanie, I'll answer your question really briefly. We do allow text messaging, like we run the campaigns for you, for your voter base. We pull the voter data for you. We send the messaging out after we confirm the text message script with you. We send them out to your voter base. We filter out the opt-outs, and we consistently run that for you. If you go pro, and I'm not sure if you are pro, I can look it up right after this call. But if you are pro, you get 5,000 free messages. So we'll send out the first 5,000 messages for free. And after that, the rate is with the picture. So if you want to send a picture of your campaign flyer or whatever with the text message, it would be about 3.5 cents per message for everyone you want to do after that. And we can send the invoice and run the text messages for you. And if you have a team, we can also we can train your team up on how to respond to the messages and we can get them in the Scale to Win platform for you. So it's a really interesting tool, man. You should check it out.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to wrap up our call here. First of all, again, thank you guys for your thoughtful questions. Thank you, Alex, for your expertise. As always, I want to encourage people to keep this conversation going and to join the Discord, where we have a channel just for certified candidates, so you can get peer-to-peer support from each other on an ongoing basis. I saw Joe mention that they have some tips for TikTok and the algorithm and expanding local presence. I'd love to get those tips posted in the Discord so everybody can be sharing those. Quinn is dropping a link for you guys to join that in the chat, so by all means click that now if you're not already in there. Also, we have another training event in 2 weeks, so come back for that. We'll have another conversation just like this on a topic that the Discord channel is helping us to pick. And then finally, we have a referral program that you can learn more about in the Discord as well, that can earn you additional free texts and additional perks in our pro tools. So hop in that Discord channel and tell your friends. So we're looking forward to getting as many goodparty.org candidates elected as possible between now and the end of the year. We're off to a heck of a start. So thank you, everyone. It was good seeing you.